Welcome, and if you've recently taken the oath of American citizenship, this is especially for you. We're going to dive into the First Amendment, but maybe not in the way you expect, because to really get it, you have to understand a really crucial idea. The Constitution wasn't a finished document when it was written.
Think about it. After the framers designed this whole new government, with the president, courts, and Congress, the people didn't just stand up and cheer. Nope, they pushed back. They looked at this new machine of power, and they demanded protection from it.
And this is the most important part. The First Amendment wasn't some generous gift handed down from on high. It was a correction, a demand that was forced by ordinary citizens who knew exactly how power works. They basically said, you can govern, but you will not rule our minds, our faith, or our words.
So, let's get into that. Why wasn't this big, powerful system of government enough all on its own? Well, when the Constitution was first drafted, it was basically just a machine. It laid out the structure, the checks, and the balances, but it didn't really spell out how the government had to leave people alone.
You can really see that gap right here. On one side, you've got the machine, president, courts, Congress, but the people knew something was missing. They demanded written, crystal-clear protections for the things that matter most: your conscience, your speech, and your faith.
And this wasn't some abstract idea they came up with, not at all. This demand came from memory, from lived experience. These were people who had lived under governments that forced a state religion on them, punished them for speaking their mind, and used the law itself as a weapon to shut down criticism. They knew that tyranny doesn't always show up with an army. Sometimes it shows up with a law.
So that's what led them to demand amendments. And let's just reframe what an amendment really is. It's not a flaw. It's not a mistake. It's actually a promise kept. The framers built a legal way to change the Constitution right into the system. And that's pretty revolutionary because it proves they didn't completely trust themselves or the future. Power gets to make the rules, but the people get to change them.
Okay, so all of this thinking leads directly to your 5 core freedoms. The First Amendment isn't a suggestion, it's not a nice idea, it's a powerful command. It draws a line in the sand and tells the government exactly where it has to stop. And it all starts with these 5 simple words: Congress shall make no law. That's not poetry, it's not advice, it is a direct command, telling the most powerful legislative body in the entire country what it is absolutely forbidden to touch. So, what can't they touch? Well, these 5 things. First, religion. The government can't set up a national church or outlaw your faith. Second, speech. You can criticize the government without getting arrested for treason. Third, the press. The state doesn't own the truth. Fourth, assembly. You can gather with other people to protest peacefully. And fifth, petition. You can complain to the people in power and demand change without being afraid.
And where they put these is so important. They are first for a reason. Before guns, before courts, before soldiers, the people protected the freedom to think, to speak, and to gather. Why? Because they understood that without these basic rights, everything else just falls apart. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated. For those of you who are new citizens, and especially if you happen to be Muslim, a question is probably going to come up for you, and asking it doesn't make you disloyal. It actually makes you responsible. It's a test of whether this country can be honest with itself.
So the promise of the amendment seems really clear, doesn't it? It says it protects all religions. It explicitly forbids Congress from making any law that would ban a faith. The freedom to worship is supposed to be guaranteed.
So, the question is, why? Why wasn't Islam treated equally? Why were Muslims, who have been here from the very beginning, basically invisible for so many generations? Now, this question isn't an attack on America. It's a really important look into the gap between the nation's promise and what actually happened. So let's try to answer that. Let's look at the gap between that legal promise and the reality people lived. And to do that, you have to understand the specific and pretty limited job of the First Amendment.
Here's the key difference. What the amendment does is it stops the government from banning your religion. But what it doesn't do, and was never really designed to do, was stop societal prejudice, racism, or economic exclusion. Islam was never actually outlawed by Congress, but that didn't protect Muslims from all these other powerful forces.
So you have to ask, why did one religious community flourish while another one struggled? It wasn't because of a law passed in Washington. As you can see here, wealth and power, well, they tend to follow the majority. Institutions, they favored what was familiar. And public perception, one was seen as normal, while the other was often met with fear. The Constitution stopped the state, but it didn't stop society.
So, was the Constitution lying? Our source here argues no, but it made a really dangerous assumption. It assumed that citizens, over time, would use their freedoms to fix injustice. For a lot of groups, that fix was incredibly slow. Muslims weren't beneficiaries of an early fix. They were survivors of that delay.
And that brings us to the final, and I think the most important idea here. It's all about reframing your role as a new citizen. You're not just a passive observer. You're now an essential participant in fixing and finishing the nation's promise.
This is such a critical way to think about it. When you take that oath, you aren't just signing up for a finished product. You're becoming a builder in this big, ongoing, and often messy, unfinished experiment. Your participation is now part of its construction.
And you don't show up empty-handed. While the American experiment wrote about freedom in these beautiful words, it often applied it very selectively. Many Muslims come to this country with what our source calls an Islamic constitutional memory, a long practical history of wrestling with how you create pluralistic societies that actually restrain power. Just think about this foundational principle from the Quran. There is no compulsion in religion. Now, that's not weaker than the First Amendment. You could argue it's actually deeper. The First Amendment disciplines the government. This principle disciplines the human ego itself. It addresses moral restraint right at the source. So, here's the bottom line. Bringing this history, this memory, this deep understanding of pluralism, it's not about replacing the Constitution, it's about helping to complete its promise. It's about helping America finally live up to its own beautiful words. And that leaves us with this. This is the question America's been asking since the very beginning. And now, as a citizen, it's a question that's being placed in your hands. It's a huge challenge, and your voice, your experience, and your heritage are now part of finding the answer. Welcome.